chakras is? Root, Om.
That's Om, yeah.
It's not root then.
Mm-hmm. Do you ever do it the other way though? And like actually put it on you? Like that?
You usually do that, but wouldn't it go like that?
No. That's when you're like putting it over your body.
Oh.
Like, there you go. Yeah.
JBC's here. I'm in JBC's house. Jeffrey Boyer Chapman's house.
Welcome, Toy.
We've been working all day.
I just spat at this by the way.
We're eating Takaya. Takaya is a Mexican chain restaurant here in Los Angeles. Mm-hmm. Not sponsored, but we like it. Taco bowl, salad bowl, chips and salsa, and got to cover a few things. So we're together because we're part of our pod, our own little pod. I've been alone all during coronavirus pandemic. Haven't seen anyone. You just have your partner, but he hasn't been here for 3 weeks, and he tested negative. Anyway, we're being safe. We're being overly safe, in fact. Following the rules.
You know, I don't think that we are being overly safe, though. I think that we are just choosing to follow the guidelines of the medical professionals that are presenting scientific data to us, whereas opposed to so many other people that we know in our lives that are choosing to navigate their way through the world at this time based on social norms and what people are doing, going to restaurants and not wearing masks and not socially distancing, and it's just not a risk that I'm willing to take, you know?
Like, basically, this whole thing, and we're not even here to talk about this, but just quickly, this whole thing has become a political stance. It's like liberals are wearing masks and conservatives are wearing, or, you know, Democrats, Republicans are not wearing masks because it's looked at as like wussy or something. I'm not really sure, but we don't need to get into that because that's not why we're here.
Yeah.
Why we're really here is to talk about, I guess, really, Black Lives Matter. If you follow me on Instagram, you saw that I've been sharing information and posting stuff about it, and you know, part of that was, I don't know what I'm trying to say. I guess I'm trying to explain my why, but my why is that, you know, my whole life, up until a month ago, I didn't pay close attention to news at all. Like, I was very much against watching the news. I don't follow politics. I don't follow the news. I thought it was negative and like, it would get me riled up and put me in a negative state of mind. Obviously, the news is awful. It's death, it's murder, it's crime, poverty, you know, bad politics, all this stuff. So I just decided I would shut it out. And I lived that way forever, fine and dandy, in my little bubble. Of course, I knew and was somewhat aware that Black people are mistreated by the cops. That was not like, oh, I didn't know that. I knew that, but I didn't pay attention. And I didn't think that, like many people in this time, didn't think it was our problem or didn't think it would matter whether we paid attention or not. It never clicked to me like I could somehow, I don't know how to explain it. It's just silly. It's silly that I lived in a world that I just assumed I didn't need to think about that. And that's not really entirely my fault, because as I've learned over the last few weeks, listening to lots of Black educators and activists, it's that we live in a system and we've grown up in a system of white supremacy that teaches us or trains us or conditions us to look away, right? And that was the exploding light bulb, like, wake-up call to me. Was like, I had never heard anyone say that. I had never heard anyone say, the system is one of white supremacy. We think of white supremacy as KKK hooded white people with burning torches going after Black people and other people of color, not in the subtleties that are being revealed now more consciously. They've always existed, but whatever. Yeah, and we can get, and this is what we want to talk about, because we've been talking anyways every day almost for the last 3 to 4 weeks, and I'm like, well, let's just talk about this, because it's not that I don't want to capitalize off this movement. I just thought, who better to talk about it than you? Like, we're already talking about it. And also because you are like one of my best friends, and it's not like we've never talked about race or racism, because we have. But I don't have a good explanation other than white privilege and white supremacy as to why I didn't decide to jump into the mix of like the conversation.
Well, here's a great place to start off, I think, and all of this conversation is going to be challenging and all of it's going to be uncomfortable, as every conversation about race, racial dynamics, microaggressions, implicit bias, systemic racism, institutional racism.
Wait, and can I just say, a lot of those words you're saying are words I didn't even know. I had to look up. I didn't know what microaggressions were until 4 weeks ago, which I'm like, anyway, sorry. So, yeah.
No, it just, you and I have talked about race, but the thing that you're describing right now is that it feels like you and so many of my other friends who are educated, wise, kind, bright people were in this fog, this haze. It's like you all are waking up out of this coma and you're like the veil's been lifted and you're seeing the reality of the world that we're living in and a world that I have seen my whole life and at times have tried to explain to you. And the conversations we've had over this past month or two, you and I could have had these same conversations 6 months ago and you wouldn't have gotten it in the way that you're getting it. We did have these conversations 6 months ago and you didn't get it. I mean, there's the example of us going to Abraham Hicks, where it's, I'm sure you all are familiar with Abraham, the spiritual leader, teacher, guru, meditation.
White lady.
But we went to an Abraham conference, an Abraham Live event. And in the Abraham Live event, Abraham, Esther Hicks, stands at the front of the room and people from the audience can get up and ask questions, come to the front of the stage and ask questions. But in order to do that, you have to raise your hand and then Abraham scans through the energetic field of the room and whoever has the least resistance is the one who stands out and the one who gets picked to come up. And time after time after time, this is my second time seeing Abraham Live, they are straight white men for the most part. There was one white gay man and there was one man of color who I believe was Hispanic, but he was straight as well. And we were having a discussion as to why that was, why it was all straight men, and specifically white men that were being chosen time after time after time. And my perspective was that white men and straight men have much less resistance in this world because they have no reason to believe that they won't get whatever it is that they're requesting because the world has been set up so that they get whatever they want. They're never going to put their hand up in the air and second guess whether their question is worthy or valid or whether or not they can take up the space that they're requesting in the same way that a queer person would, in the same way a person of color would, in the same way a woman would. You know, you and I, that was really truly our first argument. It was our first.
January?
It was in January.
Yeah.
You and I have been friends for over 10 years, and that was the first time that we had come to a point of conflict. And it was not because I was angry with you, and it wasn't because you were being, cruel by any means. It was just that I was trying to express to you my experience and perspective of the world as a person of color and how I see the truth of it, and I've seen through the veil of it my whole life, and I could see very easily why it was all straight men going up to the front because they have no resistance, and you didn't quite want to believe that.
I didn't want to believe it, and I didn't believe his experience. I did what everyone is basically being called out for right now on social media, like in my little bubble of social media, like that's called a microaggression, right? Or like kind of like gaslighting, like how like where and see again words I did not have in my vocabulary. I kid you not until 4 weeks ago, and it was like I just didn't believe Jeffrey. Like, if I'm being honest, there was just like a straight up resistance from me thinking like that could be the reason. So denying him his whole life experience of that, even as someone who has experienced racism, it goes to show, and I see this now in hindsight, how when you even say, oh, but I understand better because I've experienced racism, I can still be complicit in all of these ways that we're conditioned to, deny people of color or black people their true experience. And there is no way that I can possibly fully understand because I haven't experienced it. But and I like that's just true. But now it's just like maybe it's that like I can see the mistake I made.
Well, another example was that last week we were together and I was showing you the two poster versions for my new film. The first version of the poster featured my face front and center. It was to be sold overseas in Europe, and it wasn't selling. The second poster version that they mocked up a couple of weeks later after it wasn't selling erased me, put images on the poster that really didn't have that much to do with the film, but the point was is that the black person was gone, and it sold. And you could understand that through conversation. How racism plays into that, and how the system is set up for us to, deem one thing as acceptable and the other thing is not.
What makes me angry at myself, though, is that you're my best friend and I wouldn't believe you.
Yeah.
But
it hurt.
But I know. And I can only say that it was because I lived in my own bubble in tunnel vision and I didn't have enough exposure. This sounds stupid, but I guess proof, right? It's like now I've inundated myself listening to lots of black people tell their stories, which I didn't do before. And so I guess that's why, if I just had only you telling me this, and I think it was hard for me to accept because we were under this spell of Abraham and spirituality and like universal truths and laws that I couldn't break through my rigidness around that viewpoint.
Right. And my point to you at that point, at that time, was the law of attraction is real, but unless everybody, it's not going to apply to every single situation unless everybody's in on it, unless we're playing the same game.
And I get that now, and I just couldn't. Whatever. I was in a coma. I definitely used that analogy to say a lot. A few weeks ago, like I feel like I've woken up out of a coma, and there's really you can't. I don't want to make excuses, and I can't really I don't like even spending time speculating why, because it still feels like I'm trying to justify how I was before. It was just wrong, fact of the matter. And I'm now seeing things differently, and I'm understanding more. And I suppose that's all, like, I'm sorry that I hurt you and that hurt. And I can only do better going forward. It's like I can't take it back, but I hope that, like, we can keep having hard conversations and that.
And we are.
Yeah, we are.
Yeah,
we've had way different conversations in the last 4 weeks than we ever did before regarding any of this. And
absolutely. Yeah. I mean, we could see, even without going into it, the example of yesterday when I was trying to deal with my team and a deal that was being made, and how it was the deal being closed for me was not of the utmost importance, when the deal in itself, the intention behind it was to amplify black and queer voices. But my straight white team kind of put it to the side because they were focusing on their other straight white clients who they had jobs come in for first. But at this point in time, where Black Lives Matter is this revolution that's occurring, we're in Pride Month, the fact that that wasn't a priority is part of the problem.
That's white supremacy.
It's white supremacy.
And see, if you had it, okay, full honesty, if that story had to come up back whenever, before,
you wouldn't have gotten it.
I would have done the same thing, because I'm thinking of what I want to say, and I'm going to probably say it wrong. Even I didn't really understand privilege, and I was not even willing to accept privilege for what it is. Like, I understood that I was privileged, like I wasn't completely ignorant to that, but I didn't quite understand, I guess, the
nuances?
The nuances of it. Yeah, I don't know what I'm really...
The insidiousness of it?
The insidiousness of racism and white supremacy. So that's what I'm being exposed to now. What I want to say about that is, you live a great life, right? And this is the problem, that we think these things.
I live a life of privilege.
You live a life of privilege as
do.
well.
Yes.
And so I would probably, in my little compartmentalized, ignorant mind, have been like, then you're like more immune to anti-black racism. And what I'm realizing now is like, no, you're not. Because of your skin color, you are treated differently. No matter whether you're a black person living in poverty in the worst part of South LA or whatever, or a black person living in a more affluent neighborhood with access to stuff. Like, you do have certain advantages, but at the end of the day, it doesn't seem to matter, because this disease of racism is so ingrained. And that's what I didn't really get before. Or I was just unwilling to accept that could be the truth. And that's what everyone's figuring out right now. And there's so many people still denying that this could possibly be true. And I just know now that, like, it's not. I know, but... And I get really riled up because it's so frustrating, because once you see, of course, you see the light, you can't go back. And this is not a good analogy, but I do sometimes make some parallels to veganism, because it's the same kind of, it's not the same, but it's kind of the same for me in my experience to be like...
It's a level of consciousness.
Yes,
you know that this horrible thing is going on, but you choose to turn away from it because as long as you don't look at it, it doesn't affect you. But the reality is that it affects you.
It affects
Of course it affects you.
Yeah.
In the same way that animal cruelty affects meat eaters because of the state of the planet, and the effects on climate change, and the all of the energy and toxins they're ingesting from these animals who are in such fear and pain. I mean,
like the things that you can't see but that are happening, like harming things other than yourself. It's like we live in a self-centered, like this idea of individualism keeps coming up, which I didn't really even understand, and I completely bought into it before, and still do, and have to really undo that.
I mean, white supremacy and white privilege affects white people's lives for so many reasons, but namely because the narrative that has been constructed around it, and this fear of black people or of otherness, like white people, that's a self-imposed fear, and that's white people. That's what y'all are living with, not you. But this is something else that we get into around buying into the aspirations of white culture and of white privilege, even as people of color.
Yes, I want to talk about that, because at the beginning of this, when I say the beginning of this, we're talking like May 28th, George Floyd was murdered, and I woke up. And there was a week where I'm still reading lots of stuff. I'm inundating myself with news. I'm reading every article. I'm listening to all these people. But the first week was like crazy, and I like dove right in, and I was having some obviously I was like so uncomfortable, because I was like, oh my God, my life, and like I have a white boyfriend, and like all this shit was just like, and like how have I been complicit as a white supremacist, and how am I still, and how, like, it was, I still,
even as a biracial
person, and I was confused, but the thing I kept thinking about, it was like, okay, look, you've experienced racism because you're not white when I was younger. But once that was over, if there was subtle racism happening, I definitely wasn't like hip to it. Like I wasn't looking for it, but I consciously wanted to be a white person my whole life. I didn't want to be Japanese because I hated myself for being mixed race, and I hated the different other side.
Then you have to ask why that is.
Why? Yeah. Because white is supreme, and because white is more appealing. Obviously, if I was made fun of and people called me and stuff, it's like they hated that I wasn't like them, that I wasn't white. Yeah, so I was conditioned at an early age to buy into this system, like to value it, to hold it up to a higher standard, and to go after it. And I realized it started getting really upsetting to come to this realization, because then I was questioning everything I ever wanted, dreamt of, asked for, manifested. Like my whole spiritual construct was like, because it's built under the guise of white supremacy even still. Like the idea of like wanting wealth, right? Like growing up not wealthy, like growing up what I would consider poor in comparison to like everyone else I was around. The idea of wanting wealth, like the idea of the economics is just white supremacy and was built on the backs of black people. And like to realize all this shit and this history is just like fucked.
The thing is that we do know this. This is history that we have been taught, but we've also, chosen to not only ignore it, but just like buy into the revisionist history that has been presented to us as presenting white people as the savior, as the hero in every story, as the the conqueror in every historical event. It's just something, and there's that, and then there's Eurocentric beauty standards that people are constantly aspiring to, and I mean
wanting to date white men is built in that. Like, this is awful, but just not liking my Japanese side. My dad's Japanese. I think it was just ingrained in me to like look at white guys as like the most attractive Like, it's sick.
Well, yeah, toy. But
It's sick.
But when every magazine cover, when people's sexiest man alive is a white man year after year after year, when every Hollywood hunk is some blandly handsome white dude named Chris, when it's real though, when every pop star that you're aspiring to, that girls have posters of on their bedroom walls, are white, when every supermodel that people aspire to be like, to emulate their beauty, when they're all white, when when those are the standards and that's the norm that's being presented to us, it's inevitable that we buy into it. But it is a form of brainwashing, and we have all been brainwashed. 100%. And these are conversations that I enjoy having with you. It's something that so many of my friends of color, specifically my black friends and black people across the planet, are talking about time and time again, that it is not our responsibility to be put in a position where we have to educate white people or all of our friends who aren't hip to the reality of systemic racism. But I'm also realizing that as much as it's the responsibility of people to be watching the documentaries, reading the articles, reading the books, like consciously and continuously educating themselves, sometimes it's through the personalized stories and lived experiences of black people, especially black people that you know and love. That's going to be the thing that kind of wakes you up. So I'm happy to share my experiences and what I know and what I've lived through, because I know it's a safe space to do so. But for so long, it's felt like futile. Why even bother telling my stories, trying to have conversations or enlighten my friends? Because more often than not, it does not end well for me.
Right. Yeah, no,
Case in point with you and I. But that's just one of dozens, endless examples of me trying to give up,
and that's why it's being said. It's the work of white people to fix this system of white supremacy, of course, because you created it. You created this illusion, this delusion. You have to actively work at dismantling it. And the thing that's been so overwhelming, I guess, is to realize that, because it's so in our minds and we're seeing it and we're paying attention, it's okay, how do we fix this? I feel like that's even the bit of the pressure of the way the media's saying things.
Well, it's been 400 years of this, so it's it's going to take a little bit of time to undo.
At least 400 years to undo, if not longer. And it's of course we're making strides and there's progress being made, and I'm keeping up to date with all that stuff. There are some police reforms happening, and there's some, some police officers are getting arrested now and charged, but it's these are tiny little, they are great triumphs with this movement, or this moment that's not a moment, but with this movement that's happening. I hope, and
let's hope it's not a moment, because that's the thing, is that we're talking about this, that black people are always doing the work and have always been doing the work, and the only reason why there hasn't been sustainability in movements and moments like the civil rights movement or Black Lives Matter, when the movement first came to our awareness over 5 years ago, it's because the work that needs to be done consistently on a daily basis is by white people, and white people just kind of jump onto these trends and then fall off after a period of time. And it's wonderful to see friends going to protests and posting black squares on their Instagrams, and to know that you care. But what else are you doing? What else are you doing? Are you educating yourself? Are you challenging and investigating your own thoughts? Are you challenging the people around you who say stupid, racist shit that is hurtful or unkind or untrue? But are you challenging them and presenting them with new information? Because it's unless you're educated, I feel so many white people feel so stunted. They feel like they're going to say the wrong thing. They feel like they don't know how to challenge other people when they're faced with white supremacy or blatant racism, because they don't have the information. And it's on y'all to learn the information and to educate yourselves.
I've lumped myself in the white people, hey, white people, because I was raised basically white, and I wanted to be white. So I'm clearly when it comes to the way my brain's programmed, it is under that regime, or whatever you want to call it. So I just want to point out that I have been lumping myself in that, because I want to hold myself as accountable as I can to find where the infection is, because it's so deep that it's am I going to notice it if you're not around and I'm having some other conversation, maybe with people I don't know as well, or I think I'm getting almost like I want to see if I can do, like, I think I'm like I want to see if I can do this, because right now we're in our bubbles, we're at home, we can't do anything or go anywhere, and I'm inundating myself on social media, and social media is great, and it's been very amazing during this time to like find lots of information and find new people and people to learn from. And I've really, to be honest, I've liked just doing less of my own shit. Like, it basically made me realize how self-centered and self-absorbed I was before. Everybody was. Yeah. But so I've enjoyed just stepping out of that and like learning something that, like, of course I should have been learning it before, but anyway, I've just enjoyed drawing my attention to something else and something that's really important. And now I'm like wanting to like, I guess I'm always just like, is this enough? Like, what am I even doing? Like, I'm reading these books, I'm watching these things, and like, I have yet to really have like a real life challenge to like see it and call it out, I guess. And it will happen, but it's like, it's not happening anytime soon because we're so closed off from people. And
it goes so much further beyond blackness and anti-blackness, though. It really is the nature of white supremacy, that it's anything that's not white, that is not deemed as valuable or acceptable. And something I just want to touch on, you mentioning that as a child, you strived for whiteness. You wanted to be white. I have an endless number of people of color in my life who felt the same way. My father, who's biracial, who's half Jamaican, half white, grew up in Toronto in the 1950s, and he said the same thing. He was raised by his white side of the family, as I was raised by my white side of the family. And he said he would go to bed every night praying, begging, hoping, wishing that he would wake up white. On one of the last episodes of my podcast with Laith Ashley, who's a Dominican man, he talks about his internalized racism and how he wanted to be white, growing up as a Dominican person in New York City and just knowing the struggles that a person of color faces on a daily basis. But all of this, all of the unlearning that white people have to do, it can feel very overwhelming and it can feel like a lot of work, but I had to do the same work. I had to do all the same unlearning because although I may be black, I was raised in the same environment with the same messages being fed to me as all the rest of y'all. And because I was adopted, raised by my white family in a tiny little redneck farm town in the middle of Red Deer, Alberta, Canada. I was the only black person in my school, the only person of color in my community. The messages that I was constantly fed were that of anti-blackness, that even messages that I was fed from my own father, whether it be that black people and black neighborhoods are dangerous, or that they're not as educated and intelligent, or whatever it may be. I was fed all of the same messages, and I had to consciously undo those messages and do the work to like seek out the literature and the black literary greats that are out there in the world that have been doing this work for decades and centuries. Like, I had to do that on my own because we aren't taught this. We aren't taught this in school.
When did you realize that and then to start doing that work or like seeking out the literature? Like, when was that?
It really started for me in my early 20s when I was living in Vancouver. You and I had already known each other. I recognized that the person that I knew that I wanted to be was missing certain elements of my character, of my my own internal knowing, and my intention with stepping into this entertainment industry in the beginning was to be the thing that I never saw when I was a kid. When I would turn on my TVs, I never saw positive representation of black queer people. I really never saw any representation of black queer people. So to grow up and to become that so that other young black queer kids could turn on their TVs and have some sort of reflection of themselves, I knew how powerful that was going to be. But I also knew that I was missing the depth. It was so much more than just the shell, my physical body being on television, but like, what message do I have to relay past that, past just me being black and queer? So it was through the lived experiences of the literary greats who have been working and doing this work for decades and centuries and generations. It was through the memoirs and autobiographies of Maya Angelou and then I moved on to James Baldwin and Langston Hughes and Toni Morrison and Ntozake Shange and Audre Lorde and Bell Hooks. And it was through their experiences and their lived experiences I could begin to start seeing reflections of myself and their lived experiences, and through their stories hearing things that only I had ever experienced, because I didn't grow up in Black culture. I didn't have references around me for what was normal and what wasn't. Like, everything was just kind of what it was, and I didn't have anybody to help guide me through it. So from that point, I came to a place where I feel like it's similar to where you are now, where it's like, now I have to put this to the test. And unfortunately, in Alberta, where I grew up, and in Vancouver, there's not a big Black population. So I didn't really have anywhere to like go and put everything that I've been learning to the test. So I moved to Africa.
Yeah. But it's not like you could also, even at that time, probably start calling shit out to people, all the white people, because you were the only, if you were the only Black person saying this to them, it's like pointless.
Absolutely. Yeah. And there were always the microaggressions, always the being introduced as this is my Black friend Jeffrey, always the tall Black guy over there. People constantly commenting on how articulate I am, how well spoken I am, and it's like, bitch, compared to what? Compared to who, though, honey? So I moved to Africa. I moved to South Africa in Cape Town and immersed myself in Black culture, and was challenged on a daily basis to go outside of my comfort zone, to constantly do the unlearning, and that was so deeply ingrained in all of us that Black neighborhoods and environments are unsafe. And then from there, I moved to New York. And I didn't just move to New York, I moved to Black neighborhoods in New York. I lived in Harlem, and then I lived in Brooklyn and Prospect Park. And it was because I knew that I was never going to become the person that I wanted to be unless I lived those experiences firsthand. And I can't even really begin to express or explain to people the lessons that I learned or how it shaped me. I just know that there was like this indescribable void, this thing that was missing within me, and it was only filled up by finding reflections of myself and being around, being exposed to Blackness and Black culture.